Men der er ikke noget i dag, der kan få mig til at blive ked af, at Socialdemokratiet igen er blevet danskernes absolut foretrukne politiske parti.
Welcome to Brussels, My Love, the podcast with me, Maeve McMahon. Now, that was not an excerpt from Borgen, one of my favourite Danish TV shows. That was actually real-life Danish politics in action. Because this week, Denmark, a country many associate with Lego and Hygge, held snap general elections, with tensions rising earlier this year over Greenland and even talk of annexation from President Donald Trump. Prime Minister, that you just heard there, Mette Frederiksen, called for an early vote. But as she said there in Danish, she said, "I'm disappointed that we didn't come first," because despite her strong international profile, voters at home appeared more focused on issues like tax and education. For more on this and what it all means for Europe, I'm joined by Petros Vassoulas, Secretary-General of the European Movement International. Hey, Petros.
Lovely to be here, Maeve.
Thanks for coming, despite the rain and the sleet.
It's been quite a week for those of us who follow elections as a hobby or professionally. Two very interesting electoral contests. Starting from Denmark first, we saw a prime minister who was considering unemployment perhaps just a few months ago, suddenly reconsider her electoral chances and call an election sooner than she was supposed to capitalize on events that were unpredictable just last year. And I think a lot of people will perhaps look at the results and compare her performance over the last few elections and say that she didn't do well. But again, considering that back in November, people thought that she was basically on the way out after her party lost the mayorship of Copenhagen that they held since the last 100 years. The fact that she managed to come out of this election, perhaps not with the result that she wanted, but still in control of her own fate, able to perhaps keep her job, that in itself is quite an escape that just a few months ago wasn't on the cards.
And for now, she has submitted her resignation to the king after the big defeat. But of course, long negotiations now, potentially very tough talks to try and form a coalition be foreseen now.
Indeed. I mean, if you take a look at the results, in Denmark, they kind of, I think there were 12 parties on the ballot, and they usually have a left-wing bloc and a right-wing bloc. And, the left-wing bloc is well-positioned, perhaps, to form a coalition. The kingmaker here will be the former prime minister, the current foreign minister, or at least the foreign minister up until the elections were called, famous for fist-pumping his colleagues after that infamous meeting with J.D. Vance in Washington. So he is expected to be the one that can tilt the balance either way. His party holds 14 seats, won about 7% of the vote. Not a huge percentage, but of course in a fragmented political landscape like the one in Denmark, that can make the difference. His preference is to repeat the coalition that the left-wing and the right-wing parties had with him in the last parliament. But the right-wing bloc has ruled out the possibility of another grand coalition with the moderates as the third party. So it's all to play for. And I think to a large extent, it very much depends on calculation and appreciation of where the electoral mathematics take these negotiations.
And it's interesting because normally nobody would care about Denmark, right? But actually these elections, they were reported on CNN, they were reported on BBC, all across the world. And this is really because of Greenland, the issue of Greenland. Did that play out at all here in these elections?
We thought it would. As I mentioned earlier, it certainly affected the Prime Minister's decision to call an early election.
Sure.
But ultimately, as you mentioned in your introduction, it was everyday issues that weighed heavily on people's minds. And I think that's something that we can see across Europe, not just in Denmark. People are concerned about the cost of living crisis. They are concerned about environmental decay that we're witnessing. They're worried about their pensions, their children's education, healthcare, real issues that I think are very much at the center of everybody's minds. So often we get distracted by big global events, but ultimately when people are sitting around the kitchen table and they're looking at their finances and they're considering their short and long-term decisions, these are the things that they want politicians to sort out: education, healthcare, the retirement, and of course the well-being of themselves and their children.
The so-called bread and butter issues, right?
Indeed.
Any reactions from Brussels on these elections? Were they being watched carefully from here at all?
Very much so. Obviously, who is a prime minister or a head of state in a member state of the European Union has an impact in Brussels too, because they are, by default, a member of the European Council. They take part, intimate part, in the decisions that affect the EU as a whole. Madam Ferguson has been a very strong figure in European politics over the last year, certainly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where herself and Denmark have taken a very strong position, perhaps one of the biggest, if not the biggest, supporter of Ukraine per capita. But also she has been very vocal on various issues, including energy independence, migration, environmental policy. So, she's very respected, perhaps one of the more experienced people around the table in the European Council. And as a result, the hope is that she will return because people know her and know how to work with her.
Well, we'll keep a very close eye on that, Petros. And then I'd like to turn to Slovenia, an EU member state of just over 2 million people. They also went to the polls. What stood out to you from this election in Slovenia?
Well, I think the contents here feature two people that represent two diametrically different views of the world. On the one side, you had a liberal, pro-European politician who believes in social reforms, and he's very much open in his approach to various issues, whether it's freedom of the press, independence of the judiciary, civil society. And on the other hand, you had a politician who is a populist, big supporter of Donald Trump. You remember he came out and said that Trump won the election in 2020. Somebody who has been very pro-Israeli in his stance, critical of the European Union, anti-freedom of press, has attacked civil society. So, they couldn't be more different. And they ran very different campaigns too. Interestingly, looking at the way the polling worked out over the last few weeks of the election, perhaps Janš's affinity and closeness to Donald Trump maybe worked against him. Because the more aggressive Donald Trump became vis-a-vis the EU, but also on international affairs, the more Janš's polling dipped. And it's very possible that that had an effect in the final result.
And just regarding Robert Gallup and his party, how weakened is his party after these votes?
Well, obviously, they didn't perform as well as the last time. Remember, they came in with very high expectations. He is a relatively young figure, a background from the energy sector, with a very liberal and modern outlook. There were high expectations for his premiership. But again, fortunately, 4 years is a short period of time, and he and his government were not able to address some of the big issues that the people in Slovenia were worried, very similar to what people in Denmark were worried about, those bread and butter issues that you mentioned. So that had an effect, I think, in people's minds when they decided which way to go, and in some degree, they punished him for his inability to deliver on those very issues.
So it was pretty nail-biting, as I said. So what is next then for Slovenia?
There is another period of uncertainty where the two big parties will try to master coalitions. They will try to attract different parties into forming a government. On the one side, the Freedom Movement has about 40 seats, if we do the arithmetics, whereas Janš's Democratic Party has about 43. But of course, since the Freedom Movement came first, they should be called first to form a government. And a lot will depend on whether they're able to muster enough numbers to have the majority in parliament. There is a possibility that they will have a minority government, which will bring even more uncertainty and instability in a country that is already facing serious issues.
And what about the election campaign? It was pretty gripping, right?
It was indeed. It was actually quite exciting in many ways because aside from everything else going on, we suddenly saw the emergence of videos that were pertaining to exposing corruption. It turned out that those videos were procured with the use of an Israeli intelligence agency, which is, of course, famous for its involvement in other elections, but also for its work with disgraced Hollywood executive Weinstein. And as a result, that played quite heavily in the last few weeks of the campaign, certainly in the last few days. And to a large extent, I think perhaps contributed also in the final result and the improvement in the chances of the current Prime Minister.
And just the final question then, the view from Brussels on these elections?
Again, we were watched very closely. There is a fine balance in the European Council at the moment between, for a lack of a better term, the pro-Europeans and the anti-Europeans perhaps. And there was a fear that if former Prime Minister Janša returned to the European Council, he would side together with the likes of Fico and Orban and others. And as a result, creating even more complications in the fragmented and ineffective decision-making system that we employ here in the European Union.
And you mentioned Viktor Orban, of course, all eyes on that election taking place on the 12th of April.
I mean, speak about toxic elections, right? And campaigns that have featured all sort of unsavory events. Yes, very big election. For the first time in his 16 years in power, Viktor Orban is seriously challenged by somebody who actually used to be in his own party.
Yeah,
not so long ago, indeed. So we have seen a remarkably difficult campaign. Surprisingly, a person that is not even Hungarian has featured quite prominently. Mr. Zelensky has been in many posters across the country. Viktor Orban has chosen a very confrontational stance towards Ukraine, bringing it into the election campaign, basically claiming that unless he wins, Hungary will be pulled into war. So very inflammatory rhetoric. Unfortunately, the truth has been a victim in these elections very much, and a lot of the campaigning only characterized as based on lies more than anything else.
And we've been reporting extensively here on Euronews about those alleged leaks as well from EU summits that Hungary has been whispering to the Russians, the information of summits, what happened before and after. Well, how do you deal with something like that?
This is indeed a major breach of trust. Of course, it's understandable. People talk to international partners all the time. Member states have relationships beyond their membership of the European Union. But in this particular case, and considering how pro-Russian Viktor Orban stands vis-a-vis Ukraine especially, but in general, consider how pro-Russian he has been, how closely aligned with Putin he has been. The news that his foreign minister has been briefing basically the Russians every after meeting of the European Council, every time that the heads of state and government of EU member states gather, he was on the phone with Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, informing him about what was discussed and what was agreed. That in itself, I think, is a major blow in the trust that is felt among leaders at the European level. And unfortunately confirms what we have suspected for a very long time. And it puts Hungary itself, but its European partners also in a very difficult position going forward.
Petros Vassoulas, Secretary General of the European Movement International, thank you so much for keeping across all those various elections and for your insights and for joining us here on Brussels, My Love.
Thank you, Maeve.
And thank you so much as well to all those behind the scenes who helped us get this podcast out. Our sound technician, David Prodheim, our Brussels My Love podcast producer, Alice Carnivali, and our social media aide, Rebecca Espinasso. And if you're not already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on euronews.com or Euronews' YouTube channel. And if you like Brussels My Love, the podcast, and what we're talking about here, do leave us a review, get in touch, write to us. You can send us an email at brusselsmylove@euronews.com, or you can give us a rating and spread the word. See you soon.
Euronews.